November 2023 started like any other month for my husband David and me. We had been living in our converted camper van since late September, embracing the nomadic lifestyle we'd dreamed about for years. After visiting my sister's family in eastern Texas, we made our way to Arizona for the annual Desert Sounds Music Festival near Phoenix. The festival had been everything we hoped for. 3 days of incredible music under star-filled skies, surrounded by fellow travelers who shared our love for adventure and freedom. When the last guitar chord faded and the festival grounds began to empty, we found ourselves reluctant to leave Arizona. The stark beauty of the desert landscape had captured something deep within us. David suggested we spend a few extra weeks exploring before winter forced us to head south. The Tucson Gem and Mineral Show was still 2 weeks away, and we decided to make our way there slowly, stopping wherever the road called to us. That's how we found ourselves driving north from Phoenix toward Flagstaff on a crisp morning in mid-November. Our plan was simple: spend a few days exploring the high desert country around Sedona, then continue north to the Grand Canyon before the winter weather made camping uncomfortable. David had been researching dispersed camping spots on his tablet, cross-referencing Forest Service maps with satellite imagery to find the perfect location, somewhere remote enough for pristine stargazing but accessible enough for our van. The Coconino National Forest stretched before us like an endless carpet of juniper and pine, broken by red rock formations that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. We turned off Highway 89A onto Forest Service Road 618, a narrow dirt track that wound through stands of manzanita and oak brush. The road climbed steadily, and I could feel our ears popping as we gained elevation. "There," David said, pointing ahead to where the road split. "According to the map, there should be 2 dispersed camping spots up that branch." We took the left fork, and the road became even narrower, barely wide enough for our van. After about a mile, we crested a small hill and found ourselves looking down at 2 cleared areas, each large enough for an RV, or large tent. The first site was occupied by a white travel trailer with Montana plates. An older Chevy pickup truck sat beside it, and I could see a man in his 50s setting up what looked like an elaborate telescope on a tripod. A boy who appeared to be around 12 was helping him, carefully handling expensive-looking equipment. "Looks like we've got neighbors," I said, waving as we passed. The man waved back, and the boy looked up from his work with a shy smile. The second site sat perched on a leveled area at the very end of the road. As we pulled into it and shut off the engine, the silence that enveloped us was so complete it seemed to have weight. David stepped out first, stretching his arms above his head and taking a deep breath. "Now this," he said, "is what I call a view." He wasn't exaggerating. Our campsite sat on what felt like the edge of the world. To the south, wave after wave of mountain ridges rolled away toward the horizon, each one a slightly different shade of blue or purple in the distance. To the east, a deep valley stretched out below us, dotted with the dark green of junipers and the silver green of sage. A barbed wire fence marked the boundary of what our map indicated was a large cattle ranch, its headquarters hidden somewhere in the valley beyond the next ridge. What struck me most was the absolute remoteness of our location. In every direction, I could see nothing that indicated human presence except for the fence and the occasional dirt track winding through the landscape. No power lines, no buildings, no cell towers. When I pulled out my phone to check for signal, I wasn't surprised to see no service displayed where the bars usually appeared. "We're really in the middle of nowhere," I said, and the words carried an edge of both excitement and unease. David was already setting up our camp chairs, positioning them to face west toward what promised to be a spectacular sunset. "That's exactly what we wanted, isn't it?" he said. "Complete solitude, perfect for stargazing." As the afternoon wore on, we settled into our usual camping routine. I prepared a simple dinner on our camp stove, while David checked and adjusted our solar panel setup. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower, and I was grateful for the warm jacket I pulled from our storage compartment. It was while I was washing dishes in our collapsible basin that I first noticed something odd. A flash of light caught the corner of my eye, coming from one of the distant ridges to the southeast. I looked up, scanning the landscape, but saw nothing unusual. "Did you see that?" I asked David. "See what?" "A light, like a reflection or something, from that ridge over there." I pointed toward the area where I thought I'd seen it. David followed my gaze, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "I don't see anything. Maybe it was just sunlight hitting a piece of quartz or something metallic." I nodded, accepting his explanation, but kept glancing back toward the ridge as we finished our evening chores. As darkness began to fall and the first stars appeared, I forgot about the light entirely. The night sky above us was beginning to reveal itself in all its glory, and I was eager to see what the complete darkness would bring. That first night in the high desert was unlike anything I had ever experienced. We retired to our van shortly after sunset, following our usual routine of reading by LED lantern light before settling in for sleep. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and our small propane heater worked steadily to keep the interior comfortable. Despite the mechanical hum of the heater's fan, the silence outside felt overwhelming, pressed against our thin walls like something alive. I woke sometime after midnight, my bladder demanding attention despite my reluctance to leave the warmth of our sleeping bag. David stirred as I quietly unzipped the van door and stepped out into the cold air. The shock of the temperature difference made me gasp, and my breath came out in white puffs that dissipated quickly in the dry air. But the cold was immediately forgotten when I looked up. The night sky stretched above us like a dark canvas, splattered with diamonds. The Milky Way cut a bright swath across the heavens, more vivid and detailed than I had ever seen it. Stars that were invisible in even moderately light-polluted areas blazed with intensity that seemed almost aggressive. I stood there for several minutes, neck craned back, feeling dizzy from the sheer immensity of what I was seeing. "Incredible," David's voice said softly beside me. He had followed me out and was staring upward with the same sense of awe. "We have to stay another night," I whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow diminish the spectacle above us. "I need to see this again." We stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, picking out constellations and pointing out satellites as they traced their paths across the star field. The silence around us was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the slight wheeze of David's breathing in the cold air. When we finally returned to the van, we were both energized by what we had witnessed. "Tomorrow night we'll set up the chairs outside," David said as we settled back into our sleeping bag. "We'll make a proper event of it." The next day dawned clear and cold, with a brilliant sun that quickly warmed the air inside our van. We spent the morning exploring the area around our campsite, following game trails through the juniper and manzanita, discovering hidden arroyos and collecting interesting rocks that caught our eye. The landscape had a stark beauty that revealed new details with every change in the light. It was during one of these explorations that I first became consciously aware of being watched. We were about a quarter-mile from our van, following what appeared to be an old cattle trail toward the ranch fence, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I stopped abruptly and turned around, scanning the landscape behind us. "What is it?" David asked, noticing my sudden halt. "I don't know," I said, continuing to search the terrain with my eyes. "I just had the feeling that something was observing us." David followed my gaze, his expression growing more serious. "I don't see anything. But you know what? I've been feeling something similar all morning. Like we're not as alone out here as we thought." We stood there for several minutes, both of us carefully examining every juniper, every boulder, every shadow that might conceal a watcher. But the landscape appeared empty, populated only by the occasional lizard or desert bird. Finally, we shrugged off the feeling and continued our hike, but I noticed that both of us glanced back more frequently than usual. It was around noon when I saw the light again. We had returned to our campsite and were eating lunch outside, enjoying the warmth of the desert sun, when that same flash caught my peripheral vision. This time I was ready for it, and I turned immediately toward the source. "There," I said, pointing toward the southeastern ridge. "Do you see it? That bright flash?" David looked where I was pointing, squinting against the bright sky. For a moment we both stared at the ridge, and then it happened again, a brilliant flash of white light, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, coming from what appeared to be the highest point of the ridge. "I saw it that time," David said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "What do you think it is?" My first instinct, given my training as a wilderness first responder, was that someone might be in distress. "Could be a signal mirror," I said. "Maybe someone's trying to get attention up there." But as we continued to watch over the next hour, the light appeared several more times, always from different locations along the ridgeline. No one on foot could move that quickly across such rough terrain. The flashes seemed random, appearing every 10 or 15 minutes from points that were sometimes miles apart. "That's not someone signaling for help," David said finally, "unless there's a whole group of people up there and they're all carrying signal mirrors." The afternoon passed uneasily. We tried to focus on normal camping activities, reading, playing cards, preparing dinner, but both of us kept glancing toward the ridge. The flashes continued sporadically, and I began to feel a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. There was something about the randomness of the lights, the way they appeared from impossible distances apart, that made my subconscious mind send up warning signals. As evening approached and we prepared for our planned stargazing session, I found myself dreading the coming darkness. The beautiful night sky that had filled me with wonder just 24 hours before now seemed like a vast, dark space where anything might hide. I tried to dismiss these feelings as mere anxiety, the result of being in such an isolated location, but the knot in my stomach continued to tighten as the sun sank toward the western horizon. Our neighbors, the man and boy with the telescope, had spent the day making trips to Sedona and had returned just before sunset. I could see them setting up their equipment again, and the normalcy of their presence provided some comfort. At least we weren't completely alone out here. But as full darkness fell and we stepped outside with our camp chairs, I could no longer ignore the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The temperature had dropped below freezing by the time we set up our chairs facing east, away from where our neighbor's campfire cast a warm glow in the distance. David had prepared a thermos of hot coffee, and we wrapped ourselves in heavy blankets as we settled in to watch the night sky. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The stars emerged in their magnificent display, satellites traced their predictable paths overhead, and we pointed out planets and constellations to each other in whispered conversations. It was approaching 11 o'clock when I first noticed that something was different from the previous night. One star in particular seemed brighter than the others, hanging in what I thought might be the position of Polaris, the North Star. But as I continued to observe it, I realized that its intensity was fluctuating slightly, growing brighter and dimmer in an irregular rhythm. "David," I said quietly, "look at that star. The bright one, almost directly overhead. Does it seem strange to you?" He followed my pointing finger and focused on the star in question. For several minutes, we both watched it pulse and flicker. "That's definitely not normal stellar behavior," he said. "Stars don't change brightness that quickly unless something's passing in front of them." We continued to observe the anomalous star and gradually became aware that it was not only changing in brightness, but also in position. So slowly that it was almost imperceptible, it was moving against the background of fixed stars. What had started as a point of light nearly overhead was now noticeably displaced toward the southern horizon. "That's not a star," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And it's not a satellite either. Satellites don't change brightness like that." As if responding to my words, the light suddenly intensified, becoming so bright that I could see it casting faint shadows on the ground around our chairs. Then, just as suddenly, it dimmed to a pale yellow glow and began to move more rapidly across the sky. Its path was erratic, unlike anything I had ever seen. Not the steady arc of a satellite or the predictable course of an aircraft, but a stuttering, irregular progression that reminded me of the flight pattern of a hummingbird. "Are you recording this?" David asked, his voice tight with tension. I fumbled for my phone, but when I tried to focus the camera on the moving light, it appeared as nothing more than a faint blur on the screen. The device's automatic settings couldn't seem to lock onto the object, and manual adjustments produced no better results. For the next 20 minutes, we watched the light perform its aerial dance. It would hover motionless for several seconds, then dart to a new position hundreds of yards away in the space of a heartbeat. Its color shifted constantly, white to yellow to red to blue, sometimes cycling through the entire spectrum in a matter of seconds. The movements were unlike anything in my experience, defying what I thought I knew about the physics of flight. Then, without warning, the light began to descend. At first, it appeared to be landing somewhere on the distant ridge where I had seen the flashes earlier that day. But as it continued to lose altitude, I realized with growing alarm that it was coming toward our general area. The light maintained its color-shifting display as it dropped below the tree line, disappearing behind the large juniper that stood between our campsite and the ranch fence. "It's behind the tree," David whispered, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him over the sound of my own heartbeat. We sat frozen in our chairs, afraid to move, afraid to speak above a whisper. The juniper tree was perhaps 50 yards from our position, large enough to conceal a small building. For several minutes, nothing happened. The normal night sounds of the desert, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, seemed muted, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Then I saw movement. A soft glow emanated from behind the left side of the juniper, pulsing gently in shades of deep purple and violet. The light had a quality unlike anything artificial I had ever seen. Not the harsh glare of electric illumination, but something organic, almost living. As I watched, transfixed, the glow began to shift position, moving slowly from left to right behind the tree. "It's moving around the tree," I breathed, barely audible. The light continued its circuit, and gradually I began to make out what appeared to be a structured form within the glow. It was roughly humanoid in shape, perhaps 6 feet tall, but the proportions seemed somehow wrong. The head appeared too large, the limbs too thin and elongated. As it moved, the light emanating from it shifted through a spectrum of colors, deep blues, purples, magentas, creating an almost hypnotic display. Then, to my horror, I realized that it was watching us. The figure had stopped its movement around the tree and was positioned where it could observe our campsite. Although I couldn't make out any distinct features through the glow, I had the unmistakable sensation of being studied, examined with an intelligence that was both alien and deeply unsettling. The quality of its attention felt invasive, as if invisible fingers were probing at the edges of my consciousness. For what felt like an eternity, we remained locked in this tableau. 2 humans huddled in their chairs, and something inexplicable studying us from behind a juniper tree. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees, and I realized I was shivering uncontrollably, though whether from cold or fear I couldn't say. Then, in a moment of panic that I still can't fully explain, I jumped to my feet. The sudden movement was involuntary, driven by some primal flight response that overrode my conscious mind. The camp chair toppled backward, clattering against a rock, and I took several quick steps toward our van. The reaction from the figure was immediate and terrifying. The gentle, shifting colors vanished instantly, replaced by a harsh, pulsing red light that seemed to radiate anger and aggression. The figure dropped low to the ground, moving with a fluid, predatory motion that reminded me of a large cat preparing to pounce. From my new position, I could see it crouching behind the lower branches of the juniper, the red glow painting the surrounding vegetation in hellish shades. "Run!" I said to David, though the word came out as barely a croak. We both bolted for the van, abandoning our chairs and blankets in our haste to reach safety. My hands shook so violently that I could barely work the door handle, and David had to help me get it open. We tumbled inside, slamming the door behind us and engaging both the deadbolt and the privacy chain. Our van's windows were covered with reflective insulation for warmth, blocking our view of the outside world. In that moment, I was grateful for the barrier, even though part of me knew that the thin aluminum walls of our vehicle would provide little protection if the thing outside meant us harm. We sat in the darkness of our van, holding each other and listening to the silence outside. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard throughout the desert. David's breathing was rapid and shallow, and I could feel tremors running through his body. Minutes passed, then an hour. Gradually, our panic began to subside, replaced by a numbing exhaustion and a creeping doubt about what we had actually witnessed. "Did that really happen?" I whispered into the darkness. "I think so," David replied, his voice hoarse. "But I'm not sure I believe it myself." We spent the remainder of that night huddled together in our van, jumping at every small sound from outside. The crack of cooling metal, the rustle of wind through juniper branches, the distant calls of coyotes echoing across the desert. Neither of us suggested looking outside to see if the entity was still there. Some instinct deeper than conscious thought warned us that opening those doors again before daylight would be a fatal mistake. Dawn came slowly, the eastern sky lightening by degrees until pale sunlight began filtering through the small gaps around our window coverings. Only then did we finally muster the courage to peer outside. David carefully pulled back a corner of the insulation covering our front windshield and looked toward the juniper tree. "I don't see anything," he said after several minutes of careful observation. "It looks completely normal out there." We spent another hour inside the van, drinking coffee and trying to process what we had experienced. In the growing light of day, the events of the previous night began to feel like a shared nightmare. The human mind, I discovered, has a remarkable ability to rationalize even the most inexplicable experiences. "Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon," David suggested. "Ball lightning or swamp gas or something like that." I wanted to accept this explanation, to dismiss what we had seen as a misunderstanding of natural forces. But deep in my gut, I knew we had encountered something that defied rational explanation. The memory of that intelligence studying us from behind the tree was burned into my mind with a clarity that no amount of wishful thinking could diminish. Eventually, the need for normal morning routines overcame our fear. We cautiously opened the van door and stepped outside into the crisp desert air. Everything appeared exactly as we had left it: our overturned chairs, the scattered blankets, the cold remains of our evening fire. The juniper tree stood silent and unremarkable, showing no sign of the otherworldly visitor that had sheltered behind its bulk. But as we moved around the campsite, collecting our abandoned items and trying to restore some sense of normalcy, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. The ground around the juniper showed what appeared to be disturbances in the sandy soil, not quite footprints, but areas where the earth seemed to have been compressed by some significant weight. The patterns were circular, approximately 3 feet in diameter, and unlike any animal tracks I had ever seen. "David," I called softly, "come look at this." He joined me near the base of the tree, and we both crouched down to examine the markings more closely. There were at least 6 of them in a rough circle around the trunk, each one pressed into the soil to a depth of perhaps 2 inches. "What do you think made these?" I asked, though I dreaded hearing his answer. David studied the impressions for a long time before responding. "I have no idea," he said finally. "They're too big and too circular to be from any animal I know of. And they're definitely fresh, probably made sometime last night." We spent the rest of the morning trying to convince ourselves that we should pack up and leave immediately. But where would we go? What would we tell people about why we had fled in the middle of the night? The rational part of my mind insisted that we had simply experienced some kind of group hallucination brought on by the isolation and the thin air at high altitude. By noon, we had decided to stay another night. Part of this decision was simple human stubbornness, a refusal to be driven away by something we couldn't understand or explain. But another part was darker, a morbid curiosity about what else we might witness if we remained. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to see this mystery through to some kind of resolution. The afternoon passed quietly. We saw our neighbors, the father and son with the telescope, packing up their campsite and preparing to leave. I considered walking over to ask if they had seen anything unusual during the night, but something held me back. Perhaps it was embarrassment at how crazy our story would sound, or perhaps it was a deeper fear that they might confirm our experience was real. As evening approached, we again found ourselves dreading the coming darkness. But this time, we were more prepared. David had charged our cameras and phones, and we had positioned ourselves closer to the van, with our doors unlocked and ready for a quick escape. The sun set in a blaze of orange and red, painting the distant mountains in shades of fire. As full darkness fell, we reluctantly stepped outside and scanned the sky. For the first hour, everything appeared normal. The same magnificent display of stars, the same peaceful silence of the high desert night. Then, at approximately 10:30, I spotted them. "There," I whispered, pointing toward the valley beyond the ranch fence. Multiple lights, moving. David followed my gaze and inhaled sharply. Across the valley, perhaps a mile away, several points of light were moving in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern. They were much smaller and dimmer than the entity we had encountered the previous night, but their movements had the same unnatural, darting quality that defied conventional explanation. "How many do you count?" David asked, his voice tight with tension. "5, maybe 6. They keep moving behind the trees, so it's hard to tell." We watched the distant display for nearly an hour, noting how the lights seemed to communicate with each other through changes in color and intensity. They moved in formation sometimes, spreading out in a line across the valley floor, then clustering together in tight groups. The colors were predominantly blue and green, much more subdued than the aggressive red we had witnessed the night before. "They're beautiful," I found myself saying, despite my fear, in a terrifying sort of way. It was while we were focused on the distant lights that I made the mistake of looking toward the ridge where I had first seen the flashes during the day. What I saw there drove every other thought from my mind and sent a wave of pure terror through my body. Silhouetted against the star-filled sky was a massive figure, at least 20 feet tall, standing motionless on the highest point of the ridge. It was too far away to make out details, but its proportions were clearly not human. The torso was too broad, the limbs too long, and there was something about its posture that suggested it was scanning the valley below with systematic precision. "David," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "look at the ridge, the high point. Do you see it?" He turned in the direction I indicated, and I heard him suck in his breath. "Dear God," he breathed, "what is that thing?" As if it had heard his words, the figure suddenly blazed with light. Not the soft organic glow we had seen the night before, but a harsh mechanical illumination that lit up the entire ridgeline. The light was so intense that I had to shield my eyes, and when I looked again, the beam was sweeping across the valley in a methodical search pattern. The smaller lights we had been watching immediately scattered, winking out one by one until the valley appeared empty. Then the beam from the ridge began to swing in our direction. "Get in the van," David said urgently. "Now!" We scrambled for the door as the brilliant searchlight swept closer to our position. Just as we reached safety, the beam passed directly over our campsite, so bright that it penetrated even our insulated windows and filled the interior of our van with blazing white light. I pressed my face against David's shoulder and squeezed my eyes shut, but the intensity was so great that I could see the glow even through my closed eyelids. The light lingered on our position for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it moved on, continuing its sweep of the surrounding area before finally shutting off. When I dared to look outside again, the ridge appeared empty, the massive figure gone as if it had never existed. We spent the rest of the night in a state of sleepless vigilance, taking turns keeping watch through the small gap in our window covering. But the desert remained quiet until dawn, when the rising sun finally drove away the terrors of the night. The third day in that accursed place began with a decision that I now recognize as pure foolishness, driven by exhaustion and a desperate need to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Despite everything we had witnessed, despite the evidence that we were in the presence of something beyond human understanding, we chose to stay yet another night. "We can't let fear control our lives," David said as we prepared breakfast on our camp stove. "Maybe if we can document what's happening here, we can find some rational explanation." His words sounded reasonable in the bright morning sunlight, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee into our metal cups. The events of the past 2 nights had taken a toll on both of us that went beyond simple sleep deprivation. There was a brittleness to our nerves, a constant state of hypervigilance that left us jumping at the smallest sounds. Throughout the day, I found myself obsessively scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the entities we had encountered. The ridge where we had seen the massive figure appeared innocent enough in daylight, just another line of rust-colored stone and scattered vegetation against the blue sky. But I knew that when darkness fell, it would transform into something far more sinister. It was during our afternoon exploration of the area that we discovered something that shattered any remaining hope that we were dealing with natural phenomena. About a quarter mile from our campsite, hidden in a small arroyo that cut through the desert floor, we found them. A series of depressions in the rocky ground that were clearly not natural formations. The marks were scattered across an area roughly 50 yards in diameter, each one a perfect circle burned into the stone itself. The rock within these circles had been somehow fused, creating a glass-like surface that reflected the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. The edges of each circle were raised slightly, as if the stone had been heated to such an intense temperature that it had actually flowed like liquid before cooling again. "This is impossible," David said, kneeling beside one of the larger formations. "It would take temperatures of over 2,000 degrees to melt granite like this. And look at the precision. These circles are perfect, down to the millimeter." I counted 17 of the formations, ranging in size from 3 feet to nearly 10 feet in diameter. They were arranged in no pattern that I could discern, scattered randomly across the floor of the arroyo, like the footprints of some enormous, otherworldly creature. The largest of them was deep enough that I could have stood in it up to my knees. "How long do you think these have been here?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. David examined the edges of several formations, noting how weathering had rounded the raised rims and filled some of the smaller circles with wind-blown sand. "Based on the erosion patterns, I'd say months, maybe even years. This isn't something that happened last night." The implications of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. We were not witnessing an isolated incident, but rather the latest chapter in a long-running drama that had been playing out in this remote corner of the desert for an extended period. The thought that these entities had been operating here for months or years, unseen and undocumented, filled me with a creeping dread that made my skin crawl. As we made our way back to the campsite, I noticed other details that I had previously overlooked. Certain juniper trees showed signs of damage that couldn't be explained by wind or weather, branches that had been twisted into impossible spirals, bark that bore scorch marks in geometric patterns. In several places, the sparse desert grass had been flattened in perfect circles, the vegetation compressed but not broken, as if some enormous weight had rested there briefly before moving on. "We're in their territory," I said as we reached our van. "This whole area belongs to them, and we're just trespassing." David nodded grimly. "The question is, what do they want with us? Are we just observers to whatever they're doing here, or are we somehow part of it?" That evening, as the sun set for what I prayed would be our last time in that place, we made preparations for what we hoped would be our final night of observation. David had rigged up a makeshift blind using our camp chairs and a tarp, positioned to give us a clear view of both the valley and the ridge while providing some concealment. We had our cameras ready, phones charged, and a detailed plan for documentation. But as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, I felt a familiar knot of terror forming in my stomach. The desert night no longer held wonder for me. It had become a dark stage where horrors beyond human comprehension performed their mysterious rituals. The first sign that this night would be different came at approximately 9 o'clock, when a low humming sound began to emanate from somewhere in the distance. It was barely audible at first, more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Gradually, the sound increased in intensity until it filled the entire desert with a resonance that made my teeth ache. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to David, though the question was unnecessary. His face was pale in the starlight, and he was pressing his hands against his ears as if trying to block out the sound. The humming continued for nearly 20 minutes, rising and falling in complex harmonic patterns that seemed almost musical, but in a way that was deeply unsettling to human ears. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped, leaving a silence so complete that it felt oppressive. That's when they appeared. The lights came not from the valley or the ridge, but from the sky itself. At first, there was just one, a bright point of white light that seemed to emerge from among the stars themselves. But as we watched in horrified fascination, more lights began to appear, until the entire dome of the sky was filled with dozens of moving points of illumination. They moved in formation, executing complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for any aircraft I knew of. The lights would cluster together in tight groups, then spread out in perfect geometric patterns, triangles, squares, complex spirals that rotated slowly against the backdrop of stars. Their colors shifted constantly, creating a light show that was both beautiful and terrifying in its implications. "This isn't possible," David breathed beside me. "There must be 50 of them up there, maybe more." As if responding to his words, the entire formation suddenly changed direction, moving as one entity toward our position. The lights descended slowly, maintaining their complex patterns as they approached the ground. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as they drew closer, their combined illumination growing bright enough to cast sharp shadows on the ground around our campsite. Then, when they were perhaps 100 feet above us, they stopped. The entire formation hung motionless in the air, and I had the unmistakable sensation that we were being examined, studied by dozens of alien intelligences that were as far beyond human understanding as we were beyond the comprehension of ants. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of our own rapid breathing. I wanted to run, wanted to dive for the safety of our van, but some deeper instinct warned me that any sudden movement might trigger a response that I was not prepared to face. Then, without warning, one of the lights detached itself from the formation and began to descend directly toward us. It moved slowly, deliberately, its glow shifting through the entire spectrum of visible light. As it drew closer, I could make out a structure within the light, not the organic fluid form we had seen behind the juniper tree, but something more mechanical, more purposeful. The entity landed perhaps 20 feet from our position, its light dimming to a soft blue glow that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. Through the translucent illumination, I could see what appeared to be a complex mechanical device, all angles and geometric forms that hurt my eyes to look at directly. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly artificial, like a robot designed by an intelligence that had never seen a human being. For several minutes, the entity remained motionless, its light pulsing steadily as it studied us. Then, slowly, it began to move in our direction. Each step was deliberate, measured, closing the distance between us with inexorable precision. That's when my nerve finally broke. I bolted from our makeshift blind, abandoning our carefully laid plans in a burst of pure animal panic. Behind me, I could hear David scrambling to follow as I sprinted toward the van. The door seemed impossibly far away, and I was certain that at any moment I would feel some alien appendage seizing me from behind. We reached the van together, tumbling through the door in a tangle of limbs and desperation. As David slammed the door shut and engaged the locks, I looked back through our rear window and saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The entire formation of lights had descended to ground level, surrounding our van in a perfect circle. The mechanical entity that had approached us stood directly behind our vehicle, its blue glow painting our rear window in eerie shadows. And beyond the circle of lights, I could see other shapes moving in the darkness. Tall, spindly figures that walked with an inhuman gait, converging on our position from all directions. We were surrounded, trapped like specimens in some cosmic laboratory, with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. The isolation that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a death sentence, cutting us off from any possibility of rescue or escape. As the lights outside grew brighter and the shapes drew closer, I pressed my face against David's shoulder and prayed to whatever God might be listening that we would survive the night. The siege began at 11:17 p.m. I know the exact time because I was clutching my phone like a lifeline, watching the digital display as our world collapsed into nightmare. The battery showed 37%, our last tenuous connection to the world we had known, though the no service message reminded us that we were beyond any hope of calling for help. Outside our thin aluminum walls, the entities had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around our van, their lights pulsing in synchronized patterns that seemed to follow some alien mathematics. Through the gaps in our window coverings, I could see that there were at least 20 of them, each one maintaining its position with mechanical precision. The blue glow from their illumination had transformed our campsite into something resembling the bottom of an ocean, everything bathed in shifting underwater light. "They're studying us," David whispered, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him over the sound of my own thundering heartbeat. "Like we're some kind of experiment." The mechanical entity that had first approached us remained directly behind our van, its light brighter than the others, casting our rear window in sharp relief. Through the translucent barrier of our window covering, I could make out its silhouette, tall, angular, with appendages that moved in slow, deliberate gestures. It was doing something, manipulating what appeared to be a complex device that projected holographic displays into the air around it. But it was the other shapes that truly terrified me. The tall, spindly figures that had emerged from the darkness now stood between the circle of lights, motionless as statues but clearly aware of our presence. In the shifting illumination, I could make out details that defied rational description. Limbs that bent in too many places, heads that were the wrong shape entirely, proportions that hurt my mind to contemplate. They stood perfectly still, like sentinels waiting for some signal that would determine our fate. "What do they want?" I breathed into the darkness of our van. As if responding to my question, the humming sound returned, but this time it was coming from all around us, emanating from the circle of entities themselves. The vibration was so intense that I could feel it in my bones, making my teeth ache and causing our metal walls to resonate like the skin of a drum. The sound built in intensity until it was almost unbearable, then shifted into complex harmonic patterns that seemed to carry meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. Then, impossibly, the humming began to form words. We, no, you. The voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, not spoken but somehow transmitted directly into our minds through the medium of that otherworldly sound. It carried no emotion, no inflection, just a flat statement of fact that chilled me to the core. Fear. Not needed. David's hand found mine in the darkness, his grip so tight it was painful. They're trying to communicate, he whispered. Dear God, they're actually trying to talk to us. The harmonic voice continued, each word separated by long pauses that were filled with that bone-deep humming. You observe. We observe. Same purpose. I wanted to respond, wanted to ask the 1,000 questions that were racing through my mind, but terror had robbed me of the ability to speak. My throat felt constricted, my mouth dry as desert sand. Understanding. Required. Cooperation. Beneficial. The words were followed by a sound that might have been static, or might have been laughter, or might have been something else entirely. Then the humming stopped, leaving us in a silence that felt heavier than before. For several minutes, nothing happened. The entities maintained their circle, their lights pulsing in those same synchronized patterns, while the tall figures stood motionless between them. I began to hope that the communication was over, that perhaps they would now withdraw and leave us alone. Then the mechanical entity behind our van began to move. I could hear it clearly now, a soft whirring sound, like electric motors, accompanied by the gentle hiss of hydraulic systems. The device it had been manipulating projected new patterns into the air, complex geometric forms that rotated and twisted in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The light from these projections grew brighter, casting moving shadows through our rear window that danced across the interior walls of our van. It's coming closer, David said, his voice tight with fear. The whirring sound grew louder, and I could see through our side window that the entity was indeed approaching our van. Its mechanical movements were smooth and purposeful, each step calculated with inhuman precision. When it reached our vehicle, it stopped directly beside David's door and began to emit a new sound, a series of rapid clicks and beeps that reminded me of a computer modem connecting to the internet. Then, to my absolute horror, our van's electrical system began to respond. The LED strip lights that ran along our ceiling flickered on without anyone touching the switch. Our radio crackled to life, cycling rapidly through static-filled stations before settling on a frequency that carried that same alien humming we had heard before. The small LCD display on our solar charge controller began scrolling through random numbers and symbols, as if some external force was accessing our electrical systems directly. It's hacking us, David said, his voice hollow with disbelief. It's actually interfacing with our electronics. The invasion of our systems continued for several minutes, with various devices switching on and off seemingly at random. Our water pump cycled several times, our propane detector beeped intermittently, and our phone chargers began emitting high-pitched whines. Throughout it all, the mechanical entity remained beside our van, its clicking and beeping sounds increasing in complexity as it probed deeper into our electronic infrastructure. Then, suddenly, our main electrical panel shut down entirely, plunging us into complete darkness. The silence that followed was absolute. No electrical hum, no LED displays, nothing but the sound of our own panicked breathing. Even the lights outside seemed to have dimmed, as if the entities were conserving energy for whatever was coming next. That's when I heard the new sound, a soft scratching like claws or talons against metal coming from the roof of our van. Something's on top of us, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The scratching continued, moving slowly from the front of our van toward the rear, accompanied by a weight that made our entire vehicle flex slightly. Whatever was up there was heavy, much heavier than any bird or small animal. The sound it made as it moved suggested appendages with sharp points, scraping against our aluminum roof with each careful step. David reached for the flashlight we kept beside our bed, but when he clicked it on, nothing happened. Whatever the mechanical entity had done to our electrical system had apparently affected our battery-powered devices as well. We were trapped in absolute darkness, with something inhuman prowling across our roof and alien entities surrounding us on all sides. The scratching sound stopped directly above our heads, and I could feel the roof of our van sagging slightly under concentrated weight. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then came a new sound that made my blood freeze in my veins, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingers drumming against metal. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was clearly intentional, a pattern of communication that was somehow both alien and familiar. After a moment it was repeated, the same rhythm exactly. Tap, tap, tap. "It's trying to get our attention," David breathed. "It wants us to respond." I knew he was right, but the thought of acknowledging the presence above us filled me with terror. What if responding was interpreted as an invitation? What if it was a test that we were already failing by our silence? The tapping continued, growing more insistent, until it was joined by a new sound, a low, keening wail that seemed to come from the entity on our roof. The sound was filled with such alien loneliness that it made my heart ache despite my fear. Whatever was up there, it was trying to establish contact in the only way it knew how. Finally, driven by some impulse I still don't understand, I reached up and tapped back against our ceiling. 3 soft knocks that mirrored the rhythm I had heard. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The keening sound rose to a crescendo of joy, and suddenly our electrical system blazed back to life, filling our van with light and sound. Every device we owned began operating simultaneously. Lights flashing, radio blaring, fans spinning, water pump cycling, creating a symphony of electronic chaos that was somehow celebratory in nature. Outside, the circle of entities began to pulse more rapidly, their lights shifting through every color of the spectrum in complex patterns that were dizzying to watch. The humming sound returned, but now it carried harmonics that almost sounded like music, like some vast alien choir singing in frequencies just barely within human perception. As suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Our electrical systems returned to normal. The lights outside dimmed to their previous level, and the weight on our roof shifted as the entity above us moved toward the rear of our van. "I think," David said slowly, "I think we just passed some kind of test." But even as he spoke those words, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. The entities might have accepted our attempt at communication, but we were still surrounded, still trapped in their circle of light with no way to escape. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that acknowledgement might be only the first step in a process that would end with us never leaving this desert at all. The thing on our roof began to move again, its claws scratching against metal as it repositioned itself. And in the glow of the alien lights surrounding us, I saw new shapes emerging from the darkness beyond. More tall figures, more mechanical entities, a gathering that suggested this night was just beginning. At 2:47 a.m., everything changed. I know because I had been staring at my phone's clock face for hours, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness, each second bringing us deeper into a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. The entities maintained their vigil around our van, their lights creating an otherworldly dome of illumination that had transformed our campsite into something that belonged on an alien world. The weight on our roof had shifted several times during the night, always accompanied by that deliberate scratching sound that suggested intelligence and purpose. Whatever was up there was conducting its own examination of our vehicle, probing and testing with an alien curiosity that I found both fascinating and terrifying. It was during one of these periods of relative quiet that David suddenly grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered urgently. I listened carefully, straining to detect whatever had caught his attention. Then I heard it, a new sound coming from outside, different from the mechanical whirring and alien humming we had grown accustomed to. This was organic, unmistakably human, the sound of voices talking in low, urgent tones. "There are people out there," I breathed, hardly daring to believe it. The voices were coming from beyond the circle of entities, somewhere in the darkness past their ring of light. I could make out at least 2 distinct speakers, both male, though their words were too distant and muffled for me to understand what they were saying. "Maybe it's a rescue team," David said hopefully. "Someone else saw the lights and came to investigate." But even as he spoke those words, I felt a growing dread in the pit of my stomach. Something about the voices didn't sound right. There was a quality to them that seemed wrong somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify what was bothering me. The conversation outside continued for several minutes, the voices moving slowly around the perimeter of the entity circle. Gradually, I began to pick out individual words and phrases, and what I heard made my skin crawl. Specimens appear to be responding to contact protocols. Neural activity indicates heightened awareness. Prepare for extraction sequence. These were not the words of a rescue team. These were the clinical observations of researchers discussing their test subjects, and with growing horror, I realized that David and I were those subjects. "Listen," I whispered urgently. "They're talking about us like we're lab rats." David strained to hear better, and his face went pale as the meaning of the conversation became clear. "Those aren't rescuers," he said, his voice hollow. "They're part of whatever this is." The voices moved closer to our van, and now I could hear them with crystal clarity. There were 3 speakers, all male, all speaking in the flat, emotionless tones of professional scientists. "Subjects have demonstrated successful communication interface with Collection Unit 7, one voice reported. "Stress indicators remain within acceptable parameters." "Acknowledged," replied a second voice. "Phase 3 authorization granted. Initiate direct contact protocol." "Copy that. Beginning approach sequence now." The humming sound that had become the soundtrack to our nightmare began to fade, and one by one, the lights surrounding our van started to dim. The mechanical entity that had been stationed beside our door moved away, its whirring sounds growing more distant. Even the weight on our roof shifted and then vanished entirely, leaving us alone in our van for the first time in hours. But instead of relief, I felt only a deeper terror. Whatever was coming next, the entities were clearing the way for it. "David," I said, my voice shaking, "I don't think those things out there are aliens at all." He looked at me in the darkness, and I could see understanding dawning in his eyes. "You think they're human? Some kind of government project?" Before I could answer, a new light appeared outside our van. Not the ethereal glow of the entities, but the harsh white beam of a powerful flashlight. It played across our windows for a moment, then clicked off, leaving us in darkness once again. "Occupants of the vehicle," a voice called out, clear and authoritative. "This is Dr. Kenneth Morrison of the Atmospheric Research Division. Please exit your vehicle slowly with your hands visible." My heart sank. This was no alien encounter, no mystical experience with otherworldly beings. We had stumbled into some kind of classified military or scientific operation, and now we were witnesses who needed to be dealt with. "What do we do?" David whispered. "We comply," I said grimly. "We don't have much choice." The voice outside called again, more insistent this time. "Immediate compliance is required. Exit the vehicle now." With trembling hands, David reached for the door handle. "Stay calm," he said, though I could hear the fear in his voice. "Act cooperative. Maybe they'll just want us to sign some non-disclosure agreements and let us go." But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We had seen too much, been too intimately involved in whatever experiment they were conducting. The clinical way they had discussed us, the references to extraction sequence and specimens, these were not the words of people planning to simply send us on our way. David opened the door and stepped out into the night, his hands raised high. I followed reluctantly, squinting against the sudden brightness of multiple flashlights trained on us. Around the perimeter of what had been the entity circle, I could now see at least a dozen human figures in dark clothing, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles. "Step away from the vehicle," Dr. Morrison commanded. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, wearing what appeared to be a military uniform without insignia. "Move slowly toward my voice." We complied, walking carefully across the uneven ground toward the cluster of figures. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I began to make out more details of our captors. They were clearly military personnel, armed with sophisticated equipment that included not just night vision gear but also devices I couldn't identify, instruments that hummed with electronic activity and displayed readouts on small screens. "Dr. Morrison," one of the soldiers said, "the subjects show elevated stress indicators but appear to be unharmed by the contact experience." "Excellent. Morrison replied, making notes on a tablet computer. This confirms our hypothesis about gradual exposure protocols. The entity's interaction patterns are becoming more sophisticated. I couldn't stay silent any longer. What entities? I demanded. Those things weren't real, were they? This is all some kind of experiment. Dr. Morrison looked up from his tablet, and even in the dim light I could see him smile. Oh, I assure you, the entities are very real indeed, though perhaps not in the way you might think. He gestured to one of his subordinates, who approached carrying a device that looked like a sophisticated tablet connected to various sensors. You see, we've been conducting research into artificially induced perception phenomena. The lights, the figures, the mechanical entities, all of them were projections, holographic displays combined with electromagnetic manipulation of your nervous systems. My mind reeled at the implications. You mean we were hallucinating? The whole thing was fake? Not fake, Morrison corrected. Artificially induced, yes, but the experiences themselves were entirely real from your perspective. We've been testing the effectiveness of our projection systems in controlled field conditions, using unwitting subjects to validate our theoretical models. David stepped forward, anger beginning to replace his fear. You experimented on us without our consent. That's illegal, immoral. That's classified, Morrison interrupted sharply. And unfortunately for both of you, that classification extends to your very knowledge of this project. The soldiers around us shifted position, and I noticed for the first time that several of them were carrying what appeared to be medical equipment: syringes, portable monitors, restraint devices. My blood ran cold as I realized what Morrison was implying. You can't just make us disappear, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. People know where we are. When we don't show up. Actually, Morrison said, consulting his tablet again, our background check indicates that you told your family you were planning to camp in dispersed sites throughout Arizona for several weeks. No one expects to hear from you for at least a month. And this particular location is so remote that your disappearance will be attributed to any number of natural hazards: flash floods, animal attacks, simple accidents that claim the lives of inexperienced campers every year. The trap we had walked into was complete and perfect. We were miles from any help, surrounded by armed soldiers, with no way to contact the outside world. Even if we somehow escaped, who would believe our story about government agents using holographic technology to simulate alien encounters? However, Morrison continued, I'm authorized to offer you an alternative to permanent disappearance. Our project requires long-term test subjects for ongoing research. Volunteers who agree to participate in our studies receive comfortable accommodations, excellent medical care, and the satisfaction of contributing to important scientific research. And if we refuse? David asked, though we both already knew the answer. Morrison's smile never wavered. Then you become another tragic statistic of desert camping gone wrong. I'm afraid those are your only options. As the weight of our situation settled over me, I looked up at the star-filled sky that had seemed so beautiful just a few nights before. Now it looked cold and distant, a vast emptiness that would swallow our screams without a trace. We had come to the desert seeking solitude and natural wonder, but we had found something far darker, proof that the most terrifying monsters in the universe weren't aliens from distant worlds, but human beings who had abandoned their conscience in pursuit of scientific knowledge. You have 30 seconds to decide, Morrison said, checking his watch. Though I should mention that either way, you'll never be leaving this desert. The only question is whether you leave it alive. The 30 seconds that Dr. Morrison had given us stretched into an eternity of impossible decisions. Around us, the soldiers maintained their positions, their night vision goggles giving them an insectoid appearance that was somehow more disturbing than the alien entities we now knew to be fabrications. The desert silence pressed in on all sides, broken only by the electronic humming of their equipment and the distant call of a coyote that seemed to mock our predicament. 20 seconds, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the casual indifference of a man who had delivered this ultimatum many times before. David and I exchanged glances in the harsh glare of the flashlights. In his eyes, I could see the same desperate calculation that was racing through my own mind. Were they really prepared to kill us? Could we somehow escape? Was there any possibility that Morrison was bluffing about the permanence of our situation? But even as these thoughts flashed through my consciousness, I knew they were futile. The military precision of the operation, the sophisticated equipment, the casual way Morrison discussed our disappearance. All of it pointed to an organization with vast resources and no moral constraints. We were not the first civilians to stumble into their web, and we would not be the last. 10 seconds. The reality of our situation crystallized with brutal clarity. We could choose to die here in the desert, our bodies becoming food for the carrion birds and our story dying with us. Or we could choose to live, at least temporarily, as unwilling participants in whatever horrific research Morrison and his colleagues were conducting. It wasn't really a choice at all. "We'll cooperate," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Morrison nodded as if he had never doubted the outcome. "A wise decision. Dr. Reeves, prepare the subjects for transport." A woman in military fatigue stepped forward, carrying what I now recognized as a medical kit. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, with the kind of clinical detachment that could only come from extensive practice in dealing with unwilling subjects. "This will help you relax during the journey," she said, in a voice that might have been discussing the weather as she prepared a syringe. "It's a mild sedative. You'll remain conscious but feel much calmer about your situation." "What kind of research?" David asked suddenly. "If we're going to be your test subjects, we have a right to know what you're planning to do to us." Dr. Morrison considered the question for a moment, then apparently decided that there was no harm in explaining. "We're studying the human brain's response to artificially induced supernatural experiences. The project began as an investigation into the psychological warfare applications of holographic technology, but we've discovered something far more interesting." He gestured toward the area where the false entities had performed their elaborate deception. "We can create experiences so realistic, so convincing, that they become indistinguishable from reality in the subject's memory. More than that, we can implant entirely false memories, complete with emotional responses and sensory details." My stomach turned as the implications became clear. "You're developing brainwashing technology." "We prefer the term memory restructuring," Morrison replied with academic precision. "The applications are virtually limitless. Imagine being able to give soldiers complete confidence in their mission by providing them with fabricated memories of enemy atrocities, or creating witnesses to crimes that never happened, complete with vivid recollections that would stand up to any polygraph examination." Dr. Reeves had finished preparing her syringe and was approaching me with professional efficiency. "Please extend your arm," she said. "This will be much easier if you don't resist." I had no choice but to comply. The needle slipped into my vein with practiced ease, and within seconds I could feel a warm relaxation spreading through my body. The sharp edges of my terror began to soften, replaced by a dreamy detachment that made the entire situation feel unreal. "Very good," Morrison said as Dr. Reeves moved on to David. "Now, I want you both to understand that your cooperation over the next few months will determine how comfortable your stay with us becomes. We have facilities that range from dormitory-style accommodations to isolated holding cells. Your attitude will determine which type of housing you receive." As the sedative took hold, I found myself oddly fascinated by the technical aspects of what they had done to us. "The entities," I said, my words coming out slightly slurred. "How did you make them seem so real?" "Holographic projectors combined with electromagnetic field manipulation," Morrison explained, apparently pleased to discuss his work. "We can stimulate specific regions of the brain to induce feelings of fear, awe, or wonder. The projectors create visual and auditory hallucinations, while targeted electromagnetic pulses trigger the appropriate emotional responses." "The physical evidence," David mumbled as his own injection took effect. "The burn marks in the rock, the impressions in the ground." "Laser scoring and pneumatic presses," Dr. Reeves answered matter-of-factly. "We prepare each test site weeks in advance, creating the physical evidence that subjects will discover and interpret as proof of otherworldly visitation. It's remarkable how eager the human mind is to believe in the supernatural when presented with even minimal supporting evidence." Two soldiers approached with what appeared to be lightweight gurneys, and I realized that despite Morrison's assurance that we would remain conscious, the sedative was stronger than advertised. My limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, and my vision was beginning to blur around the edges. "The transport vehicle is standing by," one of the soldiers reported. Excellent, Morrison said. Begin loading sequence. I want to be back at the facility before dawn. As they lifted me onto the gurney, I managed to turn my head enough to see our van sitting abandoned in the clearing. It had been our home for months, our refuge and sanctuary as we explored the country. Now it would sit here until the elements claimed it. Another piece of evidence supporting the story of two campers who had vanished without a trace in the unforgiving desert. What about? I struggled to form the words through the growing fog in my brain. What about our families? They'll look for us eventually. Morrison's face appeared above me as they secured restraints around my wrists and ankles. Oh, but they won't, he said with that same clinical smile. You see, in about 6 months, you'll contact them yourselves. You'll call or write to explain that you've decided to start a new life somewhere remote, cutting all ties with your past. You'll be very convincing because by then, you'll actually believe it's true. The horror of his words penetrated even through the chemical haze. They weren't just planning to imprison us, they were going to completely rewrite our personalities, our memories, our very sense of self. The people we had been would cease to exist, replaced by whatever versions Morrison and his team chose to create. As they loaded my gurney into what appeared to be a military transport vehicle, I caught a glimpse of the night sky one last time. The stars that had filled us with wonder just a few nights before now seemed cold and distant, indifferent witnesses to human cruelty. Somewhere up there, I thought drowsily, there might be real aliens looking down at Earth, wondering if our species was worth their attention. If they were smart, they would give us a wide berth. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness completely was the sound of the transport vehicle's engine starting up, carrying us away from our old lives and toward a future that existed only in the twisted imagination of government scientists. Behind us, our van sat alone in the desert clearing, a monument to dreams of freedom that had ended in a nightmare of captivity. But even as the darkness claimed me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this wasn't the end of our story. Somewhere in the months ahead, there would come a moment when Morrison's control slipped, when his technology failed, when the human spirit proved stronger than his machines. That voice was all I had left to hold on to as the desert disappeared behind us, taking with it the last traces of the people we used to be. The red numbers on the vehicle's dashboard clock read 4:23 a.m. as we drove into oblivion, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks in the sand and a story that would never be told. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, in a house my parents purchased in 1996 when I was 6 years old. The property sat on the edge of town, where suburban lawns gave way to dense forest. My parents chose the location specifically for the expansive backyard, nearly 3/4 of an acre of mature maple and birch trees, with a small stream meandering along the rear boundary. The previous owners had constructed a treehouse between two towering maples near the back fence. When we moved in, the structure was weathered and unsafe, but my father saw potential. He spent the entire first summer rebuilding it from the ground up, reinforcing the platform, installing proper walls, and adding a sturdy shingled roof. The finished product stood 15 feet above the ground, accessed by a wooden ladder he'd bolted securely to the larger maple. From the treehouse windows, really just square openings cut into the plywood walls, you could survey the entire backyard, the babbling creek, and the vast wilderness preserve that stretched for miles beyond our property line. The isolation was both thrilling and unnerving for a child. Our nearest neighbor lived a 1/4 mile away, and on quiet evenings, the only sounds were wind through branches and water flowing over stones. By age 8, I practically lived in that treehouse during summer months. My mother would pack me sandwiches and juice boxes, and I'd spend entire days up there, reading comic books, building with Legos, or simply watching the wildlife that frequented our yard. Deer would emerge from the forest to drink from the stream. Raccoons would waddle through in the early evening. Once I spotted a black bear lumber past, though when I told my parents, they suggested it might have been a large dog. The treehouse became my sanctuary, my private kingdom above the world. Looking back now, I realize how vulnerable I was up there, a small child, alone and elevated, visible to anyone who might be watching from the woods. But at 8 years old, I felt invincible in my wooden fortress, completely unaware that something in those dark trees was beginning to take notice of my daily routines. The summer I turned 10, in 1999, my best friend was a boy named Connor Mitchell. He lived on the other side of our neighborhood and had been dealing with his parents' increasingly bitter divorce. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital, and his father had moved to an apartment across town, so Connor spent most days at our house. My parents welcomed him warmly, understanding that he needed stability during such a chaotic time in his young life. Connor and I were inseparable that summer. We'd established elaborate games and rituals in the treehouse. Sometimes we were Arctic explorers trapped in an ice station, other times we were submarine commanders in the depths of the ocean. We'd haul up supplies for entire days, comic books, Connor's portable radio, bags of chips, and thermoses of lemonade. My mother would call us down for meals, but otherwise, we were left to our own devices. The first sign that something was wrong came during the third week of July. Connor and I were in the treehouse around 6 in the evening, engaged in a heated debate about which X-Men character was the strongest, when we heard something large moving through the underbrush near the stream. At first, we assumed it was another deer. They were common in the area and often came to drink in the early evening. But this sounded different. Instead of the light, careful steps of a deer, we heard heavy, deliberate movement. Branches were being pushed aside rather than carefully navigated around. The sound was methodical, purposeful, as if whatever was moving was searching for something specific. Connor and I pressed our faces to the window, trying to get a glimpse of what was making the noise. The setting sun created long shadows across the yard, making it difficult to distinguish shapes. We could see the tops of bushes swaying near the creek, but the source of the movement remained hidden. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The forest became unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, even the creek seemed to flow more quietly. Connor whispered that maybe we should go inside, but something kept us frozen at the window. After several minutes of silence, we heard something that made both of us step back from the window. It was a sound I'd never heard before and couldn't easily describe, a rhythmic clicking like someone rapidly tapping two stones together, but with an organic quality that suggested it wasn't being made by an animal or human. The clicking continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We waited another hour in the treehouse, speaking in whispers, before finally climbing down and running to the house. That night, I lay in bed replaying the sounds in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a woodpecker or some other common bird. But deep down, I knew I'd never heard any bird make those clicking sounds. 2 weeks later, Connor and I finally convinced my parents to let us sleep overnight in the treehouse. We'd been begging all summer, and they relented on the condition that we'd come inside if we got scared or if weather threatened. My father strung up a battery-powered lantern and made us promise to check in every hour until bedtime. We prepared for the adventure like we were embarking on a polar expedition. We hauled up sleeping bags, pillows, a cooler full of sodas and snacks, and a bag of books and games. As darkness fell, we settled into our sleeping bags and began telling ghost stories, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the plywood walls. Around 10:30, we heard our neighbor's dog, Rusty, an aging golden retriever who lived in the house closest to ours, begin barking frantically. Rusty was typically a quiet dog, content to sleep on his owner's porch, so his aggressive barking immediately caught our attention. Connor and I paused our storytelling to listen. The barking continued for several minutes, growing more desperate and fearful. Then, without warning, it stopped mid-bark, as if Rusty had been suddenly silenced. Connor and I looked at each other in the lantern light, both thinking the same terrible thought. What could make a dog stop barking so abruptly? We turned off the lantern and peered out the window toward Rusty's house. Their motion-activated security light was flickering on and off repeatedly, creating a strobing effect across their backyard. In the intermittent illumination, we could see Rusty's doghouse, but no sign of the animal himself. Then we heard footsteps in our own yard. Not the soft padding of an animal, but the deliberate placement of feet moving through grass. The steps were accompanied by that same clicking sound we'd heard weeks earlier, but closer now, much closer. The footsteps seemed to circle the base of our tree, sometimes stopping directly below us. Connor grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't pull away. We sat motionless, afraid that any sound might draw attention to our hiding spot. Through the floorboards, we could hear someone, or something, moving around the base of the tree. The footsteps were too heavy to be made by any local wildlife, too deliberate to be random. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the sounds faded toward the creek. We waited another hour before Connor whispered that we should make a run for the house. I told him we should wait until dawn, whatever was out there might still be nearby. He didn't argue. We spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, listening for any sound that might indicate the return of our uninvited visitor. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. When morning finally arrived, we packed up quickly and climbed down, both of us eager to reach the safety of the house. The next day, while Connor was visiting his father, I gathered enough courage to investigate the area around the treehouse. In the soft earth near the stream, I found footprints that made my stomach turn. They were human in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be unusually long toes. The prints were deep, suggesting someone much heavier than a child, and they formed a clear path from the forest to our treehouse and back. I wanted to show the prints to my parents, but I knew they'd ask questions I couldn't answer. How could I explain that Connor and I had been too terrified to come down from the treehouse? How could I describe the clicking sounds and the circling footsteps without sounding like I was making up stories? Instead, I tried to fill in the prints with my shoe, but they were too large and too deep. The disturbed earth remained visible, a reminder that something had been in our yard, something that walked upright but wasn't quite human in its proportions. Over the following weeks, strange incidents multiplied. Our garbage cans were repeatedly overturned, but unlike typical animal intrusions, the contents weren't scattered randomly. Instead, items were arranged in neat piles, as if someone had been methodically searching through them. Food items were left untouched, while papers and other materials were sorted into organized stacks. My mother's garden decorations began disappearing and reappearing in different locations. A ceramic owl that usually sat on our porch railing was found placed carefully on a fence post near the woods. A decorative wind chime was moved from the front yard to a tree branch near the creek. When my mother asked if I'd been rearranging things, I denied it, but I could see she was puzzled by the systematic nature of the relocations. Most disturbing was the smell that began appearing in our yard during evening hours. It was a thick, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered. Not quite animal, not quite human, but organic and wrong. The smell would hang in the air for 10 or 15 minutes, then dissipate completely, leaving no trace. My parents occasionally noticed it but attributed it to a passing skunk or some other wildlife. Connor and I avoided the treehouse for several days, but eventually returned during bright daylight hours. We'd convinced ourselves that we'd been overreacting, that the mysterious visitor had been nothing more than a vagrant passing through the area. But we made sure to leave well before sunset, and we never spent another night up there. 3 weeks after our frightening sleepover, Connor was staying at my house again. We'd spent the evening playing video games in my room, which faced the backyard and offered a clear view of the treehouse and forest beyond. It was past midnight when something struck my bedroom window. Not hard, just a light tapping sound like small pebbles being thrown against the glass. We paused our game and listened. Another tap, then another, with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. My bedroom was on the second floor, making it impossible for someone to reach the window without a ladder, or by climbing the large oak tree that grew near the house. Connor suggested it might be moths attracted to the light from my room, but the tapping was too purposeful, too controlled. We crept to the window and peered out carefully, staying low to avoid being seen. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light across the backyard and making the treehouse visible as a dark silhouette against the trees. At first, everything appeared normal, but then Connor gripped my shoulder and pointed toward the forest edge. Something was moving between the trees, a tall, thin figure that seemed to flow rather than walk. It was difficult to make out details in the moonlight, but its proportions were disturbing. The torso was too long, the arms too lengthy, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. As we watched in horror, the figure approached the oak tree that supported our treehouse. Instead of using the ladder, it began climbing the trunk itself, moving with spider-like agility. Its elongated arms reached impossibly far, pulling its body upward in quick, jerky movements. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the treehouse structure. Connor and I backed away from the window, our hearts hammering. Connor whispered frantically, asking what we should do, whether we should wake my parents. But I knew that adults would demand explanations we couldn't provide. We were 10-year-old boys claiming to see something that defied logical explanation. We'd be told we were having nightmares or letting our imaginations run wild. So we huddled on my bed, staring out the window, waiting for whatever was in the treehouse to show itself again. The wait was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed magnified. After what felt like hours, we saw the figure emerge from the treehouse, but this time it climbed down the far side of the tree, keeping the trunk between itself and our house. It moved across the yard with that same fluid, unnatural gait, stopping once to look directly up at my bedroom window. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. The features were wrong, stretched and distorted, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Connor and me shaking with terror. We didn't sleep that night. We took turns watching the window, but the figure didn't return. In the morning, we tried to convince ourselves it had been a dream, a shared hallucination brought on by too much junk food and late-night video games. But when we finally worked up the courage to check the treehouse later that day, we found evidence that our visitor had been real. The treehouse had been altered. Our belongings, which we'd left scattered around the small space, had been arranged in precise patterns. Comic books were stacked in a perfect pyramid in the center of the floor. Action figures were lined up in military formation along one wall. Most unsettling, the battery-powered lantern we'd left hanging from a hook was now sitting outside the treehouse, placed carefully at the base of the tree. Connor and I climbed up to investigate, but the wrongness of the scene was overwhelming. Everything had been touched, moved, arranged by hands that weren't ours. The space felt violated, contaminated by an alien presence. We grabbed our most valuable possessions and fled, never to return to our former sanctuary. That was the last time Connor and I spent time together in the treehouse. His parents' divorce was finalized that August, and he moved away with his mother to live with relatives in another state. Before he left, we made a pact never to tell anyone about what we'd seen, but we also never talked about it between ourselves. Some experiences are too frightening to put into words, even with your closest friend. The strange incidents continued throughout the fall, even after Connor was gone. Our outdoor furniture would be rearranged overnight, lawn chairs moved into perfect circles, the picnic table relocated to different spots around the yard. My mother began keeping a log of the incidents, convinced that someone was playing elaborate pranks on our family. The clicking sounds became a regular part of evening background noise, though I seemed to be the only family member who noticed them. They would start around sunset and continue intermittently until well after midnight. Sometimes they came from the forest, sometimes from our own yard, and occasionally from disturbingly close to the house. I began sleeping with my bedroom curtains drawn tight, afraid to look out at night. But even with the windows covered, I could sense when the figure was in our yard. The air would feel different, thicker, more oppressive. The normal sounds of night would fade, replaced by an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. My academic performance suffered that fall. I had trouble concentrating in school, and my teachers noticed that I seemed tired and distracted. At home, I jumped at unexpected sounds and refused to go outside after dark. My parents attributed my behavior to Connor's departure and the stress of starting a new school year, but I knew the real cause of my anxiety. The thing in the woods was still watching, still visiting our property, still rearranging our belongings according to some incomprehensible logic. And with each passing week, its presence felt more intrusive, more threatening. In December, a severe ice storm struck our area, coating everything in a thick layer of frozen precipitation. The weight of the ice brought down power lines and tree branches throughout the region. In our backyard, one of the massive maples that supported the treehouse split down the middle, taking half the structure with it when it fell. My father hired a crew to remove the fallen tree, and the damaged treehouse remains. I was secretly relieved. With the structure gone, perhaps the nightly visitor would lose interest in our property. For several weeks, this seemed to be the case. The clicking sounds stopped, the furniture rearranging ceased, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted our evenings began to fade. But in February, something happened that changed my understanding of what we'd been dealing with. I was walking home from school when I noticed police cars parked at the entrance to the forest preserve behind our house. Curious, I approached one of the officers and asked what was happening. He explained that they'd found evidence of someone living illegally in the woods, makeshift shelters, stolen property, and signs of long-term habitation. What made the discovery particularly disturbing was the nature of the camp. The person had been collecting items from surrounding neighborhoods and arranging them in bizarre patterns and structures. The officer described finding carefully constructed arrangements of lawn furniture, garden decorations, and children's toys, all laid out in complex geometric patterns among the trees. Photographs and personal items taken from houses had been organized into elaborate displays. Most unsettling were the detailed notes and sketches documenting the daily routines of local families, when they left for work, when children played outside, which houses had dogs. As the officer spoke, I realized with growing horror that our family had been among those being watched and documented. The person living in the woods had been studying us, learning our habits, and gradually working up the courage for more direct contact. The treehouse had been visible from deep in the forest, and my daily presence there had made me a primary target for observation. The authorities never found the person responsible for the camp. They suspected he'd fled the area when the treehouse came down, possibly interpreting its destruction as a sign that his presence had been discovered. But they did find evidence suggesting he'd been living in the woods for years, surviving by scavenging and stealing, and becoming increasingly obsessed with the families whose properties bordered the forest. Years later, when I was in high school, I researched the history of our area and discovered that the forest preserve had long been associated with stories of hermits and recluses who chose to live off the grid. Local newspapers from the 1980s contained several reports of wild men spotted in the woods, people who'd rejected society and survived by their wits in the wilderness. Some of these individuals had been harmless eccentrics, but others had become dangerous as their isolation and mental illness progressed. The clicking sounds Connor and I had heard were likely some form of self-soothing behavior or communication attempt by someone whose grip on reality had been severely compromised by years of solitude. Understanding the rational explanation for our experiences didn't diminish their impact on my life. I've never been comfortable in wooded areas since that summer, and I still sleep with curtains drawn tight. The knowledge that someone had been watching me, studying my routines, and gradually working up the courage to make contact remains one of the most violating experiences of my life. Connor and I reconnected briefly through social media in college, but we never discussed what happened during that summer in 1999. Some experiences are too personal, too frightening to revisit, even with the person who shared them. The fear we felt was real, even if we didn't understand its source at the time. My parents still live in the same house, though they've installed security lighting and cameras around the property. The forest preserve has been more heavily patrolled since the discovery of the illegal camp, but I still feel uneasy when I visit. Sometimes, walking across the backyard where the treehouse once stood, I catch myself listening for clicking sounds in the woods. The thing that disturbs me most is not knowing what might have happened if the treehouse hadn't come down that winter. The person in the woods had been growing bolder, more willing to approach the house, more comfortable with making his presence known. Where would that escalation have led? What did he want from us? I've learned to live with these questions, but I've never forgotten the lesson they taught me. The world contains people who exist outside the boundaries of normal society, individuals whose isolation and mental illness can make them unpredictable and dangerous. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that are entirely human, driven by loneliness and madness to behaviors that defy understanding. God only knows what his ultimate intentions were, but I'm grateful I never had to find out. The drive up to our family cabin in March of 2023 should have been peaceful. I was 24 then, old enough to appreciate the silence that comes with leaving the city behind, but young enough to still feel excitement about a week away from everything. My mother drove while my 15-year-old nephew sat in the back seat with our German Shepherd Ranger. The winding road through the Indiana hills seemed to stretch forever, each turn taking us deeper into the kind of wilderness that makes you remember how small you really are. The cabin sat perched on a ridge overlooking miles of dense forest. My grandfather had built it in the 1970s, and though we'd modernized it over the years with better insulation and a new roof, it still maintained that rustic charm that made you feel disconnected from the modern world. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed how the trees seemed to lean in closer than I remembered from previous visits. The bare branches created a web of shadows that moved and shifted with even the slightest breeze. "Looks like we're the only ones crazy enough to be up here this early in the season," my mother commented as she turned off the engine. She was right. Most of the neighboring cabins appeared empty, their windows dark and their driveways unplowed from the last snowfall. The isolation felt complete and absolute. Ranger immediately began pacing once we let him out of the car, his nose working overtime as he processed all the scents of the forest. I watched him carefully, noting how his ears kept swiveling toward the tree line, as if he were listening for something specific. Dogs have always been more attuned to their surroundings than humans, and his behavior struck me as unusually alert for a place he'd visited many times before. By evening, we had settled into our familiar routines. The temperature had dropped significantly once the sun disappeared behind the hills, and the weather forecast promised several days of cold rain. Perfect conditions for staying indoors and enjoying the massive stone fireplace that dominated the cabin's main room. I built a fire while my mother unpacked groceries and my nephew set up his gaming system, though the spotty internet connection made it more decorative than functional. The wood crackled and popped as the flames took hold, filling the room with dancing shadows and the comforting scent of burning oak. We pulled our chairs close to the hearth, and my mother produced her phone to find something to read aloud. She'd always been the storyteller in our family, and scary stories by firelight had become something of a tradition during our cabin visits. "Here's one that sounds appropriately creepy," she announced, scrolling through her screen. "It's about a family who keeps hearing things outside their remote cabin." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I settled back in my chair anyway, letting the warmth seep into my bones and my eyes drift shut. The fire provided just enough background noise to make everything feel secure and contained. For a moment, I felt that perfect sense of peace that comes from being completely disconnected from the outside world. That's when we heard it. The sound cut through the night air like a blade through silk. It wasn't quite a scream and not exactly a howl, but something in between that made every muscle in my body tense. The sound seemed to come from directly behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards into the tree line. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, rising in pitch before cutting off abruptly. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you hear that?" My mother paused in her reading and looked up. "Hear what, honey?" "That sound, that howling or screaming or whatever it was." She glanced toward the windows, then back at me with a slightly confused expression. I didn't hear anything unusual. Maybe it was just the wind in the trees. But my nephew had heard something too. I could tell by the way he'd gone completely still, his game controller forgotten in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the back door, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You heard it, didn't you?" I asked him directly. He looked between my mother and me, then shrugged. "I thought I heard something, but Mom's probably right. Probably just the wind." The casualness of their responses felt wrong. The sound had been too distinct, too purposeful to dismiss so easily, and there had been no wind that evening. The air outside was still and heavy with approaching weather. The next morning brought the promised rain, and with it a strange atmosphere that seemed to settle over the cabin like a heavy blanket. My mother made coffee and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened, chatting about her plans to catch up on reading and maybe work on a jigsaw puzzle she'd brought along. My nephew retreated to his room with a stack of books, apparently resigned to a few days without reliable internet. I found myself drawn to the windows, studying the forest that surrounded us on 3 sides. In daylight, the trees looked innocent enough, just bare hardwoods and evergreens stretching as far as I could see. But something felt different about the way the shadows fell between the trunks, and I caught myself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "You're awfully quiet today," my mother observed as she joined me at the kitchen window. "Just thinking about that sound last night." She sighed and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sweetie, I know being up here can make your imagination run wild, but there are lots of perfectly normal explanations for strange noises in the woods. Could have been a tree falling, or maybe a deer caught in some brush." Her explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient. And it didn't account for the fact that both my nephew and I had reacted to the sound before she'd even acknowledged hearing anything at all. That afternoon, while my mother napped and my nephew read in his room, I decided to take Ranger for a walk around the perimeter of our property. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving everything dripping and fragrant with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. Ranger seemed eager to explore, but I noticed he kept pulling toward the back of the cabin, toward the area where the sound had originated the night before. "What is it, boy?" I asked him, letting him lead me to the edge of the tree line. He stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the closest trees and began that low, rumbling growl that dogs make when they sense a threat. His hackles rose along his neck and back, and his body went rigid with attention. I followed his gaze into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing unusual. "What's out there?" Ranger's growl intensified, and he took a step backward, pressing against my legs as if to push me away from whatever had captured his attention. I'd never seen him react this way to anything before. He was typically a confident, fearless dog who would investigate any new scent or sound with enthusiasm. We stayed there for several minutes, both of us staring into the forest, before I finally decided to retreat to the cabin. As we walked back, I could feel Ranger's tension in the way he kept looking over his shoulder, and I found myself doing the same thing. The second night brought more rain and an early darkness that seemed to press against the cabin windows like something alive. We'd settled into our evening routine: fire, comfortable chairs, and my mother's storytelling. But I found it impossible to relax. Every sound from outside made me jump, and I noticed that Ranger had positioned himself directly in front of the back door, as if standing guard. "You're making me nervous with all that fidgeting," my mother said gently. "Why don't you try to enjoy yourself? We're here to relax, remember?" I wanted to tell her that relaxation seemed impossible when every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was wrong, but I also didn't want to ruin the vacation for everyone else. So I forced myself to sit still and listen to her read from a collection of ghost stories she'd downloaded. The story she chose was about a family trapped in their home during a blizzard, hearing voices calling to them from outside. The parallels to our situation weren't lost on me, and I wondered if she'd selected it intentionally. As her voice rose and fell with the narrative, I found myself listening not just to her words but to everything else as well: the fire crackling, the rain drumming on the roof, Ranger's occasional shifts in position. That's when the scratching started. It was so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from directly above us, as if something were moving across the roof with deliberate slowness. I tilted my head, straining to isolate the sound from the rain and wind. "Mom, do you hear that scratching?" She paused in her reading and listened for a moment. "I hear the rain on the roof. That's probably all it is." But the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random precipitation. It moved from one side of the roof to the other, paused, then reversed direction. Whatever was making the sound was large enough to create distinct footfalls on the wooden shingles. My nephew looked up from his book with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was fear there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like resignation, as if he'd been expecting this. "It's getting louder," I whispered. The scratching had indeed intensified, and now it was accompanied by a different sound, a low, throaty breathing that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Ranger rose to his feet and began pacing between the back door and the front windows, whining softly under his breath. "There's something on the roof," I said with more urgency. "And Ranger can hear it too. Look at him." My mother set down her phone and studied our dog for a moment. Even she couldn't deny his obvious distress, but instead of acknowledging the sounds that were growing more pronounced by the minute, she stood up and walked to the thermostat. "Maybe we should turn up the heat. Sometimes the heating system makes odd noises when it's working hard." Her explanation was absurd. We'd been coming to this cabin for years, and I knew every sound the heating system made. This was something else entirely, something that was moving around on our roof with increasing boldness. The scratching continued for another 10 minutes before gradually fading away, leaving behind only the sound of rain and my own racing heartbeat. I barely slept that night. Every small sound from outside had me sitting up in bed, straining to listen for the return of whatever had been moving around above us. Ranger had planted himself on the floor beside my bed and remained there until morning, occasionally lifting his head to listen before settling back down with a frustrated sigh. When dawn finally arrived, I was the first one awake. I dressed quickly and stepped outside to examine the roof and the area around the cabin. What I found made my stomach turn cold with dread. The soft earth around the cabin was marked with tracks. Not animal tracks, but something else entirely. They were roughly the size and shape of human footprints, but elongated and deeper than any normal person could make. The impression suggested something heavy moving on two legs, circling the cabin repeatedly throughout the night. Even more disturbing were the marks on the cabin itself. Long scratches had been gouged into the wooden siding near the back door, and several of the roof shingles showed signs of damage consistent with something large moving across them. The evidence was unmistakable. Something had been prowling around our cabin in the darkness. I called Ranger outside to see how he would react to the tracks. His response was immediate and dramatic. His hackles rose. He began that low growling again, and he refused to approach the marked areas despite my encouragement. Whatever scent lingered in those footprints was enough to terrify a 90-pound German shepherd. Find anything interesting? I spun around to find my mother standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, looking remarkably calm for someone whose vacation cabin had been vandalized during the night. Look at these tracks, I said, pointing to the clearest impressions in the mud. And look at the scratches on the siding. Something was here last night, something big. She stepped closer and examined the evidence with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Those are unusual, she admitted. Maybe we should call the local sheriff's office and report some vandalism. Her suggestion seemed reasonable on the surface, but something about her tone felt wrong. She was looking at clear evidence that something dangerous had been stalking around our isolated cabin, and her primary concern was filing a police report. Mom, I don't think this was vandalism. I think there's something living in these woods, something that's been watching us. She sipped her coffee and gazed out at the forest with an expression I couldn't interpret. Honey, I know this is frightening, but we can't let our imaginations get the better of us. There are reasonable explanations for everything we've seen and heard. But as she spoke, I noticed her eyes weren't focused on the trees. Instead, she seemed to be studying something specific in the distance, as if she were looking for something she expected to find there. That evening, I decided I couldn't continue pretending that everything was normal. The physical evidence, combined with the sounds we'd been hearing and Ranger's obvious distress, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Something was stalking us, and my family's refusal to acknowledge the danger was becoming more disturbing than the threat itself. We need to talk, I announced as we gathered around the fire for our third night at the cabin. My mother looked up from her book with a patient smile. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? This whole situation, the sounds, the tracks, the way you and David keep pretending nothing's happening. I need to understand what's going on. My nephew, David, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but didn't meet my eyes. My mother set down her book and gave me her full attention. I'm not pretending anything, she said carefully. I've acknowledged that we've heard some unusual sounds and seen some strange tracks, but I'm also trying to keep things in perspective. We're in the middle of the wilderness. Strange things happen in places like this. But that's just it, I pressed. You're not acting like someone who's concerned about strange things happening. You're acting like someone who knows exactly what's going on and doesn't want to talk about it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. David continued to stare at his hands, while my mother seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked finally. I'm suggesting that both of you heard the same things I did, and both of you saw the same evidence I showed you this morning. But instead of being concerned or frightened or even curious, you're both acting like this is somehow normal or expected. Another long silence. Then David finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should tell him. My mother's head snapped toward him with an expression of sharp warning. David, tell me what? I demanded. David looked at my mother, then back at me. It's just, this isn't the first time this has happened. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, not the first time? My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to both of us. David, that's enough. But David continued anyway, his words tumbling out in a rush. Last summer when we were here, and the time before that. Always the same sounds, always the same tracks. Mom made me promise not to tell you because she said it would ruin the cabin for you. I felt the world tilt slightly as the implications of his words sank in. You've been coming here knowing that something dangerous stalks around the cabin at night, and you never told me? My mother turned back to face me, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw real fear in her eyes. It's not dangerous, she said quietly. It's never tried to get inside. It's never hurt anyone. It just watches. How do you know it's not dangerous? How can you possibly know that? She hesitated, then sank back into her chair with a heavy sigh. Because your grandfather told me about it before he died. He said it had been coming around for years, probably decades. He called it the Watcher, said it was part of these woods, something that had always been here. The revelation left me speechless. My grandfather, who had built this cabin and spent countless nights here alone, had known about this thing and never warned any of us. He said it was curious about people but never harmful, my mother continued. Like it was trying to understand us but from a distance. He actually found it somewhat comforting in his later years, knowing something was keeping watch over the place. Armed with the truth, I found myself in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in those woods. But another part of me, the part that had inherited my grandfather's curiosity and stubbornness, wanted to stay and confront this mystery directly. My mother and David seemed relieved to have finally shared their secret, but they also made it clear that they expected me to accept the situation as they had. The Watcher was simply part of the cabin experience, something to be endured rather than understood or confronted. But I couldn't accept that level of passive resignation. If something had been observing our family for years, I wanted to know what it was and what it wanted. That night, I made a decision that probably wasn't very wise. Instead of hiding inside the cabin and waiting for the sounds to begin, I decided to position myself where I could observe the Watcher in return. I dressed in dark clothes, armed myself with a powerful flashlight and my grandfather's old hunting rifle, and slipped out the back door while my mother and David were settling in for the evening. I found a position about 50 yards from the cabin, behind a fallen log that provided both concealment and a clear view of the building. The night was cold and damp, with a thin mist rising from the forest floor that made everything beyond 20 feet look ghostly and indistinct. For the first hour, nothing happened. I began to wonder if my presence outside had somehow scared off whatever usually visited us. But then I heard it, the soft scraping sound of something moving through the underbrush, approaching from deeper in the forest. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by that strange breathing I'd heard before. I gripped the rifle tighter and tried to control my own breathing as the noises circled around to the back of the cabin. Through the mist, I could make out a dark shape moving between the trees. Taller than any animal, but moving with an odd, hunched gait that didn't look entirely human either. The shape paused at the edge of the clearing, and I realized it was studying the cabin just as I was studying it. For several minutes, we formed a strange triangle. The Watcher observing the cabin, me observing the Watcher, and my family inside, unaware that their secret was finally being exposed. Then the shape began to move again, circling the cabin with that same deliberate pattern I'd tracked in the mud. As it passed through a gap in the mist, I got my first clear look at what had been stalking us. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair that glistened with moisture from the mist. Its limbs were elongated and moved with an unsettling fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. But it was the face that made me grip the rifle with trembling hands. The features were almost human, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a person's face and pulled it like taffy. The eyes were large and dark, and they moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. As I watched in frozen fascination, the creature completed its circuit of the cabin and then did something that made my heart stop. It turned and looked directly at me. We stared at each other across the misty clearing for what felt like an eternity. Its dark eyes held mine with an intensity that spoke of recognition and perhaps even amusement. It had known I was there all along, Then it did something even more unsettling. It raised one elongated hand and waved. The wave was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably intelligent, and unmistakably friendly. In that single gesture, the creature transformed in my mind from a source of terror to something far more complex and mysterious. It wasn't hunting us or threatening us, it was greeting me. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching as the creature continued its patrol around the cabin, occasionally glancing in my direction as if to make sure I was still there. Its movements were careful and quiet, designed not to disturb the occupants inside. It really was just watching, just as my grandfather had said. Eventually, the creature melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a completely transformed understanding of our situation. I waited another hour before returning to the cabin, where I found my mother sitting by the dying fire, clearly waiting for me. "You went out there, didn't you?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "And you saw it?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather did the same thing his first summer here. Said he couldn't stand not knowing what was sharing the woods with him." I settled into the chair across from her, still processing what I'd experienced. "What is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Your grandfather had theories, but they were just guesses. He thought maybe it was something that had always lived in these hills, something that predated human settlement. He said the local Native American tribes had stories about forest watchers, guardians that kept track of who entered their territory." It waved at me. That made her smile for the first time since we'd arrived. "It waved at your grandfather, too. He said that was when he realized it wasn't something to be feared, just something to be respected." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the normal sounds of the forest settling into sleep. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since David's revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was afraid you'd want to leave and never come back. This place has been in our family for 50 years. Your grandfather loved it here, and I love it here. And I want you to love it too. I thought if I could just get you used to the idea gradually." "By lying to me about what I was hearing and seeing?" She winced. "By protecting you from something you weren't ready to understand, but you're ready now, aren't you?" I considered the question seriously. The fear was still there. I doubted I'd ever be completely comfortable knowing that something was watching us from the darkness. But it was tempered now by curiosity and, strangely enough, a sense of connection to something larger than myself. "I think so," I said finally. We packed up and left the next morning, but not because of fear or disgust. Our week was simply over, and we all had responsibilities waiting for us in the real world. As we loaded the car, I found myself looking forward to our next visit rather than dreading it. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence we'd maintained for most of the week. David seemed relieved to have the family secret finally out in the open, and my mother appeared genuinely happy that I'd accepted the truth about our unusual cabin guest. As we reached the bottom of the hill and the cabin disappeared behind the trees, I realized that my relationship with that place had been fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a family retreat. It was a bridge between our world and something ancient and mysterious that most people would never have the privilege to encounter. I'm already planning our next visit, and this time I think I'll be ready to wave back.